Hi, my name is Nathan Scheffler. I'm the Clinical Director at Pennsylvania Adult and Teen Challenge. I'm responsible for overseeing the short-term and detox programs, the clinical portions of those programs here at the Teen Challenge. I'm excited to be sharing with you today. I'm very excited every time I get to talk to families. I love talking to families because you guys are such an integral part, such an important part of every person's addiction recovery as they're going through this. You're part of their recovery, and we understand how important it is to have family support to be able to experience a successful recovery. Today's topic is Addiction 101. I like to be able to give just a little bit of rationale for why we're doing these trainings. So when I think about the reason why we're doing a training on Addiction 101, why we're doing the basics of addiction, for us here and as a treatment center, it's important for us to understand the basics because that's where we begin to treat addictions, where we begin to look at what's necessary for our program. We need to understand what the underlying causes of addiction are in order to be able to build a treatment plan and program around those causes so that we can reach towards a successful recovery. And that's what I want to share with you a little bit. What I'm hoping to be able to communicate today is some of the basics of addiction, the reason why addictions happen from what we understand, and then what you can do to be able to help support your loved one who's experiencing recovery. This is the first slide I wanted to have in here. I just don't get it. Have you ever found yourself saying that? Have you ever found yourself thinking to yourself, I just don't understand what is this person doing to themselves? It makes no sense whatsoever. We see them self-sabotaging, ruining everything that's ever happened in their life, and it just keeps happening and happening, and I just don't understand why this is happening. Maybe you're saying to yourself, this isn't the person that I married. Husband, your wife is deeply involved in addiction. You're saying this person is completely changed, and I don't understand what's so special about this drug that's more special than a relationship with me. Maybe you're looking at your children. You're saying, I didn't raise them this way. This isn't the way that I raised them to behave. If that's what you're saying, if you're just saying, I just don't get it, I'm hoping to be able to address that a little bit today. Maybe bring some understanding. I have no interest in making any excuses for anybody caught in addiction. But I do hope to be able to bring some of what I've found to be my understanding of addiction and share it with you, and maybe be able to help bring some clarity to this question of I just don't get it. I just don't understand. That statement, we didn't raise them this way. It's not necessarily a book endorsement, but this PowerPoint that I'm presenting, the Teen Challenge PowerPoint, I've added some bits and pieces to it, but it was created by a man named Joel Jakubowski. He wrote a book called We Didn't Raise Them This Way. You can take a look at it, look it up on Amazon. But I do know that he has a lot of good things to say to family members and a really deep understanding of why addictions happen. I'll definitely recommend his book, anything by him. This next slide, the 3 C's of addiction, something that comes straight from Al-Anon, a family support group. It's important for you to understand these things about addiction as you're experiencing it along with your loved one. First one is that you cannot cause an addiction. There's nothing that you can do to cause somebody else to develop this disease, this internal struggle. That you can't cause somebody to have an addiction. It's something that happens within them. There's certain things that we can do to influence it. We're going to look at some of those influences in a little bit. There's certain things you can do to influence somebody to help them step out of addiction. But just like you can't cause an addiction, you also can't control it. We know as we sit back and think about it that we can't control anybody else. There's nothing we can do to control another human being. The only person that we have any control over is ourselves. And the last one is that you can't cure it. You can try as hard as you possibly want to, but there's nothing you can do to cure an addiction in another person. You can't cause it, you can't control it, and you can't cure it. I want that to be something that you speak into your own life, that you share with yourself, that you tell yourself that none of these things are possible. You can't cause somebody else to have an addiction, you can't control it, and you can't cure it. As we start to dig into the impact of addiction in the United States, I want to look at some of these numbers. We understand there's a little bit more than 300 million people living in the United States, 325, I think, the last time that I looked. 300 million people living in the United States. We see that 37 million people are suffering from some kind of process addiction. Process addictions are things like gambling, sex addiction, other compulsive shopping addiction, eating disorders, things that people impulsively do that don't actually introduce a chemical into their body. 23.2 million Americans are suffering from a drug or alcohol addiction. 23.2 million suffering from a drug or alcohol addiction. If we look at that median number, that 30 million number, that means that approximately 10%, between 8 and 10% of Americans are experiencing some kind of addiction, some kind of clinical, look at what that word means with clinical, diagnosable addiction. 300 million Americans, 10% of them are experiencing some kind of diagnosable addiction. The third part of this rule of three is 300 million Americans, 30 million experiencing addiction. Only 10% of those 30 million actually find their way into treatment. If we look at 3 million people in treatment, that seems like a lot, but only 10% of the people who need help are actually getting it. I talk to patients in our program on a regular basis, and I tell them, I say, listen, out of 10% of people in America that are addicted, only 10% make it into treatment. Look at the opportunity that you have here. As you folks are working with your family members, just remind them that it's a tremendous opportunity that they've been given, one that not everybody gets, a very small amount. 1/10 of people in the United States actually make it into treatment. 90% of U.S. citizens are experiencing addiction either firsthand or know of an addicted friend or family member. Everybody in the United States knows of somebody who's experiencing an addiction, and most people are experiencing it first or second hand. 67% of all families are struggling with active addiction, somebody in their family. We look at some of these other numbers. If we read down through there, it's not a surprise to anybody. We've been seeing it on the news, we've been seeing it everywhere, and for us especially, we understand this is a serious, serious problem, especially with the opioid epidemic. We have people dying in record numbers, and it just keeps going up and up. What we have seen that is just a little bit encouraging is in 2018, the end of 2017 and 2018, we started to see it level off a little bit. So something that we're doing is starting to work. We see doctors that are agreeing to stop over-prescribing opiates. We see a lot of government money being poured into treatment programs, and we're seeing it begin to work. We're seeing people actually get the help that they need. We're spending time with warm handoff programs where people can come directly from the hospital into treatment. There's a lot of motivation to be able to address this, and we're actually seeing it start to level off, but there's still a tremendous problem with addiction in the United States. As we define addiction, I look at definitions in a couple of different ways. I definitely went to Webster's definition, where it's a person who has a compulsive physiological need for a habit-forming substance such as a drug. Hang out on that physiological part. We're going to talk later about how the body changes and how it develops in response to addiction, but that term physiological, it's not just psychological, it's not just in your head, it's something that's actually a physical issue. Your body changes an organ within your body. But I also like to look at the etymology of words. My 3-year-old daughter, she asked me one day, she's like, Daddy, why do they call it a ladder? And I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, holy cow, I don't even know why they call it a ladder. So I had to look it up, right? I look up the etymology of it, find out it's some Germanic word that means to lean. And I love doing that because I love to see the reason why we use the words that we use. And if you look at the background of the word addiction, it actually comes from a legal perspective, and I enjoy that too because I'm a political science major in college. I like to look at words that have a legal background, legal meaning. So much of what we do comes from this legal background. It actually has the meaning to be delivered over, but if you read just a little bit farther, it actually has to do with giving myself over. It's me surrendering myself and giving up. Cops have me dead to rights. They say, put your hands up and turn around, and I say, okay, I give up, I surrender, I turn myself over, and then I no longer have control of my own body. That's what we're seeing in addiction, is it starts with a choice, it starts with a decision. Somebody makes the decision themselves to turn themselves in, to turn themselves over, and then once they do that, they've given up control of their life. We're going to see how that plays a part in what we're actually, how clear this definition actually is for what addiction really is. We spend a lot of time with the American Society of Addiction Medicine. This is how we decide whether a person can stay in treatment or not. ASAM is the folks that develop criteria for treatment. Everybody has to meet certain criteria to be able to stay in treatment, and they spend a lot of time trying to define what it is that is addiction and what level of treatment each person needs based on what's going on in their life. A couple of things that they say here, this last part that I underlined, addiction is a primary chronic disease, brain reward, motivation, memory. We're going to talk about all that in a minute. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. It's reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward or relief by substance use and other behaviors. That's what we see. That's what manifests, is a person who's pathologically trying to strive towards this substance use and the other behaviors. The behaviors comes from all of the stuff before that, the change in brain chemistry, the change in body chemistry. But this is the part that gets to me, because there's so much in here that defines what it is that we see on a daily basis. It's an inability to abstain. So once a person gets to an inability, it doesn't start off that way, but they get to a certain level of inability, that's when it's actually an addiction. Impairment in behavior control, inability to control their behaviors, and we see that. It doesn't just mean with controlling whether I say yes or no to a drug. It extends to behavior control across the spectrum. So it actually takes the brain and changes the ability to control my own behaviors as I'm in an addiction. Craving, diminished recognition of significant problems with behaviors. Have you seen this? Have you seen this one? Where I no longer can see what it is that I'm doing. As an addicted person in addiction, I can't see it anymore. Everybody else can. Everybody else can see that I'm screwing up my life, that I'm headed down to a really bad place, that I'm alienating my friends and my family, but I don't see it. Because there's something in this, we're going to see it again in a little bit, but there's something here that changes my ability, my ability to reflect on my own actions and decisions. Chronic disease, characteristic of relapse and remission. It's a chronic relapsing disease. That's something that we say on a regular basis. The scary thing is that it's progressive and can result in severe disability or premature death. It can change the brain to the point where it can't change back. Certain aspects of it, you can lose certain parts of your brain, and it could, in late stage addiction, result in premature death. Scary thing, death is one of the key motivating factors of what we do here. Life, preserving life, is one of the key motivating factors of what we do here. We want to be able to preserve life, keep people alive, save folks. And we recognize that addiction is a deadly disease. So how do you know if you have an addiction or not? We look to the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Health Disorders, and it's in there. I have this one highlighted in red in mine, but it goes through 11 criteria. And depending on how many criteria you meet, determines whether you have a mild, moderate, or severe addiction. That mild, moderate, or severe addiction will play into what level of treatment you need to be in. But look at what you need for a mild addiction. To actually be addicted on a mild level, you only need 2 of these. Let's read down through this list. Using more than intended. Okay, so I say I've got a little bit set aside for the weekend, I'm gonna go out and have a good time, and then I accidentally use everything or have to buy more halfway through. An inability to control use. This is manifest in a desire to slow down or stop, but you're unable to. When people start to realize that they've lost control, that they're no longer controlling it. A great deal of time spent to obtain or use the substance. This in late stage addiction turns into all day, every day, and only sleeping for brief periods in between. In early stage addiction, it may just be more time and more time and more time is spent chasing it before anybody recognizes that they have a problem. A craving. Addiction starts to manifest itself in an intense desire or urge to use. This is not just I want to, that sounds like it'd be nice. It's more than that. A craving is something that wraps up a person's entire thought process, and it's very difficult for them to pull themselves out of that downward spiral until they get to the point where they use. It comes from a change in brain chemistry. Again, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. You may have seen this one. This is a little bit more overt. but a failure to fulfill role obligations in work, school, or home. We begin to see people not spending time where they should be and not fulfilling obligations that they have. Continued use despite persistent physical, psychological, family, social, employment, or legal problems. They start to have problems in their life. They're starting to run into the cops, starting to get some DUIs, the family's starting to get frustrated with them. Maybe there's some conflict or strife in a marriage or with children. We start to see persistent, continuing problems that don't show signs of letting up. That's one of the criteria for substance use disorder. Social, occupational, recreational activities are given up or reduced. Things I used to enjoy doing. I really enjoyed going hiking, going fishing, spending time playing video games. Now I don't really care so much about that because there's something else that gives me a lot more pleasure than those things. We start to see a disregard for risk. So maybe that means starting to go into some more risky environments to obtain a substance. We see people engaging in risky behaviors. And again, that's part of addiction taking over, saying I'm more important than your safety. Disregard for risk. Continued use despite knowledge of physical or psychological impact. In the beginning of use, we're going to look at the stages of addiction, but in the beginning of use, a person doesn't really think that there's any impact on their body. They're able to use without consequences. And that use without consequences then leads to a reinforcement of the idea that all these people that told me that drugs were bad, they were wacky. They don't know what they're talking about. But as time goes on, they start to experience some consequences and they're looking around, they're saying, oh, geez, well, now I'm not thinking as clearly as I used to. I can't remember things. My body doesn't work quite the same. I can't breathe as well. They start to experience the physical and psychological consequences, but usually by the time they've gotten to that point, they're beginning to start physical dependency where they can't back out now. That's one of the criteria for addiction. So they know that it's happening, but not enough to be able to change anything. Tolerance, the need for more for the same effect or less effect with the same amount. The brain is starting to change. It's starting to need more of the substance to be able to get the same feeling, or it's beginning to need not feel as good with the continued use of the same amount. I've been drinking half of a bottle of liquor every day, and that's been doing it for me, but I'm starting to notice that a half a bottle doesn't really do it for me anymore. Now I need almost the entire bottle to be able to get to the point where I'm happy and content with how my body's feeling. And then this last one is withdrawal. Withdrawal is when you stop using and your body has built up a physical reliance on it, and then you experience the symptoms of withdrawal. It can be deadly in benzodiazepine withdrawal or alcohol withdrawal. Those are the things that desperately need medical detox facility. It's tremendously uncomfortable and potentially deadly with a lot of other drugs like opiate withdrawal or some other drugs. But alcohol and benzodiazepines are the two that the withdrawal. The physical dependence has built up so much that the withdrawal can be deadly. If you look at these, they're spaced out into the last two are physical issues, physical changes within the person. There's 3 or 4 in the middle that are social issues, and the first couple are psychological in nature. And so we start to see how this is categorized. And if you look at that, there might be some of you out there who are thinking through as we go through this list, your loved one, and you're saying, I hit every single one of those. You may be right. There's a lot of people living in severe late-stage addiction, and they desperately need help, especially in an inpatient level of care. We're seeing a lot of people who are manifesting that 6 to 11 of these, more than half of them, and are deeply engaged in their addiction. What is a drug? Spend time talking to my kids about this. They say, what's daddy do at work? Well, I work at a drug rehab, so I can't really hide that. Well, what's drugs? There's good drugs and there's bad drugs. Good drugs help us to stay healthy, but any drug can be turned into a bad drug, is how we talk to them. That's how I share with them. I think there's a lot of benefit in simplifying it to that level, but this is what we look at as our definition of a drug. It's any substance taken to modify, change, or heal. It's a chemical that affects the processes of the mind or the body. Drugs are chemicals. They're created, and they're things that we introduce into our body that can have an effect. Usually it's a positive effect, sometimes it's a negative effect, but most of the time it changes something within us. When we take a painkiller, it changes our brain's ability to feel pain in certain areas. When we take an anti-inflammatory. It can reduce swelling. So it's a chemical that we introduce that has an impact on our body. The substance that's used recreationally for its effects. Alcohol is a drug. Alcohol has an impact on the body. Many can become physically addictive, and most of them can become psychologically addictive as well. But all share the potential to become psychologically addictive. Here's a list of some of the most commonly abused drugs in the United States. Alcohol tops the list. Currently deadlier than car crashes, is what I understand. Still the deadliest drug in the United States. Heroin and opiates come in close second. I do monthly, every 3 weeks, I do a survey of our whole patient population. And we're coming up with alcohol and opiates are usually neck and neck for what most of the addictions that we're treating are. But most of the time, opiates pulls ahead just a little bit. We're treating just a little bit more opiate addiction than alcohol addiction. But we're still working with a lot of folks who have addiction to marijuana. It's legal in Pennsylvania, but there's people who are experiencing the negative effects in their life. They go through that list of 11 criteria and they tick a lot of those boxes. There's a lot of people experiencing addiction to marijuana. I've heard folks talk about a love affair that they've had with marijuana. They're deeply, madly in love with it and the feeling that they get from it. So we're treating addiction for marijuana. Cocaine or crack. If you ever want to dig into disparity in the United States, take a look at the different laws for white powder cocaine versus crack cocaine. One is more associated with affluent people. The other is associated with people who are living in poverty. Easier to attain, cheaper, less of an effect, long-term effect. But we address those two issues completely differently. What we're hoping to do is to be able to address addiction as a whole rather than just one specific drug. Methamphetamine is, it's a stimulant. It's something that we're spending a lot of time with. Club drugs, things like ecstasy, are addictive and can have that impact on people, can draw people into an addiction. Hallucinogens, something that we don't see as much of, but there are still folks who they begin using hallucinogens, and that can have a profound effect on the brain. We're seeing hallucinogens open up parts of the brain that other drugs don't, and it's fascinating to be able to sit down and work with somebody who's been addicted to hallucinogens and has they present in a different way. Prescription drugs, painkillers, barbiturates, benzodiazepines. One thing I'll say about benzodiazepines is, yes, the withdrawal can be deadly, so it's important to be able to withdraw from them in a medically monitored detox facility. Benzos are currently the most overprescribed drug in the United States. It's something that's easy to get. It treats anxiety. Anxiety is one of the biggest problems that we currently have as an American people in the United States. We seem to struggle with worrying about what's next without any clear and present danger being there, and benzos can treat that. But they also are highly addictive. And I'll tell you, the worst withdrawal that I ever saw in a patient, and this happens consistently, is from benzodiazepines. The first time that I saw it, an individual spent the entire 30 days of his 30-day program in his room, wasn't able to come out because of just crippling anxiety. And what benzodiazepines do is they relieve the anxiety for a moment, but then when the drug fades away, when the anxiety comes back at the same level, it feels that much worse. And so over the course of time, that anxiety keeps building up. We keep building up the need for more medication, and it becomes a really terrible cycle that some folks need help detoxing from. Solvents is the last one. Home-based chemicals. A lot of high school kids are finding that they can huff stuff that's in the medicine in the cleaning cabinet at home. It's tremendously dangerous. Probably one of the most dangerous things out there, most irreversible, but that's definitely something that's commonly abused in the United States. We're going to talk a little bit about risk factors versus protective factors, and anywhere you go in the mental health field, probably in the physical health field as well, we're always talking about risk factors versus protective factors. When we run into an individual who's expressing a desire to hurt themselves or kill themselves, it used to be, let's send this person to the hospital, right? They said suicide, they need to go to the hospital, they need a mental eval, probably inpatient psych or something like that. Medication, antidepressants, whatever it might be. But we're trying to change that a little bit Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, is one of the authorities on this, and they're presenting the recommendation that we take a look at risk factors versus protective factors rather than just a knee-jerk reaction to send folks to the hospital. So we're spending more time in assessment, being able to look at what does this person have working against them, what risk factors are there, things that create some level of danger, and protective factors. What do they have that's working in their favor, that's helping them? Protective factors are things that can assist them and help them to stay safe. And so we're looking at that with addiction as well. We're going to look at some of the risk factors, things that can increase danger in addiction, and protective factors are things that can help us to get out of addiction. Here we go. Risk factors for addiction. The first thing, this was fascinating the first time I heard this. The first time I saw this PowerPoint, somebody else was presenting it, and this was fascinating to me, that the number one key indicator for whether an individual may be interested in engaging in addiction at some point in their life is growing up in an unpredictable and inconsistent environment. Unpredictable and inconsistent environment. Because what do drugs do? They provide consistency. I know that when I take that substance, it's going to give me a good feeling. It's the answer sometimes for this lifetime of chaos that we're coming out of. So it says growing up, but I say even living in or experiencing an inconsistent or unpredictable environment. We find safety in routines as a human people, human beings. We find safety in routines, things being the same, predictability, and knowing that if I do this, then this is going to happen. And when that doesn't exist, then we start to find ways to try to pull it back into alignment. We want everything to line up. We want everything to make perfect sense. And when it doesn't, that's when we start to struggle a little bit. So that unpredictable, inconsistent environment is a risk factor. Some things are internal. Folks experience conduct disorders. They just have a hard time managing their themselves. Some of that is just stuff that we're born with, and it's not anything that anybody did or anybody introduced into our lives. Everybody's different. Everybody's brain develops differently, and some folks just have some disorder within their brain. Conduct disorder or a difficult temperament can be a risk factor for addiction. It doesn't mean that the person is going to have an addiction. We can go back to that first one, growing up. When we have people who grow up in terrible home environments, maybe they did grow up without parents. I used to work with a population of kids who didn't have parents. And some of them turn out to be tremendously successful. They overcome all the odds. They do just fine just because of a high level of resilience that's built in them. Maybe somebody comes into their life and helps them through something. And then there's people who grow up in the perfect home. Remember I said at the beginning, we didn't raise them this way. We grow up in a perfect home, and parents do everything that they're supposed to, and still that individual makes some poor decisions somewhere along their life and goes off the deep end. And so just because there's these risk factors don't mean that it's a guarantee. It just means that there's some things that put together, they can lead to more likelihood for an addiction. Poor social coping skills. I read an interesting study recently about people who miss periods of their life in elementary and high school spending time with friends. So the normal stuff that people do, hanging out at other kids' houses, sleepovers, going out for pizza together with some friends after school, those are all part of social training. They develop skills that we're going to need for the rest of our life, and people who develop those skills are likely to be more successful. People who miss out, they equivalated it to missing an entire year of school academically. That socially they've missed out on that amount of time, however amount of time they spent not being able to experience those social interactions, and then as they grow up, they're behind their peers in being able to develop those social skills, which can impact them later on in the workplace. You think about the social skills that are required to interact with your boss, with your coworkers, and with other folks in the public. If you're in a sales position or something like that, people who understand other people have a better chance of developing there. Same thing is true for addiction, those social skills. If we lose those social skills, a lot of the time, drug use can be a great way to develop friendships and to reduce anxiety, social anxiety. It can help us out. So when we look at social coping skills, a lot of these next couple of things are social in nature. not having those social skills can lead to addiction. Perceptions of societal approval, household substance abuse. Anytime that's normalized, anytime that substance use is normalized, you may grow up in a home where we understand that bad drugs are bad. So I grow up with this mentality, I internalize it, I look around, I see people smoking marijuana, I think that is bad. But if I'm growing up around people who are drinking or using drugs in a recreational way, then I start to normalize it, and that becomes what I internalize. This is okay. This is something that everybody does. It's something that is a regular thing. And so I begin to, that can cause an increased likelihood for addiction. A lack of mutual attachments and nurturing. I'm going to save that one because we're getting into protective factors, and that's actually the first thing on my protective factors list. Things that can create more likelihood for not engaging in addiction or for recovery. As we're looking at recovery, these are some things that can assist with recovery. I will tell you, I do, as a clinician, I did relapse potential assessments, assessing an individual's potential to relapse once they leave. High potential for relapse or low potential for relapse. And the very first thing that I look at, I'll tell you the very first thing that I look at in a relapse potential assessment is the quality and quantity of the individual's community. The people that they have around them, the people that they have to support them, to engage with, the people that if they're struggling they can go to and say, hey, I need some help, I just need somebody to talk to. The more people that they have like that who are good quality, sober people, the better their chance of recovery. If they have very few of those folks, or if the people that are in their community are using drugs or alcohol, or if they're not supportive, then that increases a person's potential for relapse. So we look at things like strong family bonds, with children in the home, parental monitoring, parents who are spending more time paying attention to their children. Get a hold of Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. He spends time talking about why people are great at things, and he goes through things like the 10,000 hour rule, that it takes 10,000 hours to practice to become the best in the field, the best of the best. Kids who have certain birthdays are better at certain things. But then he gets into what parents can do to increase the children's chance of success. And we begin to see things like time spent with children, the amount of time spent coaching. This is how you engage in this social interaction. We're going to the doctor. Do you have any questions? Let's think about this before we go. Don't be afraid to ask questions. That kind of stuff increases a child's chance of being successful in life. It can also increase that parental involvement, can also decrease a person's chance of developing an addiction. Positive social outlets, having lots of opportunities to engage socially and develop an idea of what that looks like, so that when I grow up, I don't need to go find something. And of course, if I haven't practiced it in my life, then I'm going to be looking for help in my social engagement. So maybe that help is found through a couple glasses of beer at a bar, and hey, all of a sudden I'm best friends with everybody in the joint. I begin to develop that way. Early education and prevention, talking about it early on. So if you still have young children, definitely start this conversation earlier rather than later. That works across the board. We see that in parenting models and suggestions for just about everything, is that the earlier that you can start the conversation in an age-appropriate way, the better off you are, because kids start to grow up and then they ask questions as we go instead of not really knowing where to go with it. So early education and talking about prevention with young kids. Positive role models, introducing people into a person's life that they can look up to. And coping skills. I love coping skills. It's one of my favorite things most of the time because they're actually fun to do. Coping skills are things that you enjoy doing. They're things that help you to relieve stress, anxiety. The more things that we can do to practice and learn to relieve stress, relieve emotional discomfort, better off we are. Because guess what one of the best coping skills in the entire world is? It's your drug of choice. It's the drug that you find that when you introduce it into your body, it makes you feel better than anything else. And so if you don't have anything else that helps you to feel relaxed, calm, and relieve emotional distress, then you're going to go find that substance. And when that does it, man, you just keep coming back and coming back and coming back. We'll talk a little bit about the stages of addiction. We start with experimentation and social use. defined as the voluntary use of drugs without experiencing any negative social or legal consequences. Again, we start off and we don't really experience any of those consequences, and we start to think, boy, all these people that told me drugs are bad, that's a bunch of goofballs. They don't really know what they're talking about. I can do this all day long and not come anywhere near to what people are telling me I'm going to experience. Drugs aren't bad. So we start off that way, becomes internalized, and can lead to regular use. A couple of reasons that you see there: peer pressure, social acceptance. Again, if we have the social skills, if we have a social circle that's positive, then it's going to reduce engaging with that first stage of addiction. Stage 2 is abuse, where now we start to say, well, if a little bit is good, a little bit more can only be better. Defined as continued use of drugs in spite of severe social and legal consequences. So we start to experience some of those consequences. We get into the mild to moderate stages of addiction that we saw earlier, and we're still doing okay. You know, I could pull back, I could stop anytime I wanted to, but I'm starting to experience some craving, some preoccupation with the drug, and some symptoms of depression, irritability, and fatigue if the drug is not used. But still, it's not a problem for me. If I just get my medicine, I'll be fine. Just let me keep going. Use it to cope with stress, feel pleasure, overcome inadequacy, maybe some things that we're doing, because we don't have to worry about any of that stuff if we're numb to it. We start to see some of the antisocial behaviors. If you look at sources, we start to get drugs from friends, but hey man, can you hook me up? I am out of money, but I'll gladly pay you tomorrow for a hit today. We may start to sell drugs or steal for drugs, starting to engage in some of that riskier behavior, some of the antisocial or illegal activity. And then we get to stage 3, which is late stage addiction. Drug addiction and dependency. The body has now physically developed a need for the drug. Physical dependence on a drug intertwined with addiction. It's characterized by withdrawal symptoms and compulsive use. I may not even want to use today, but it's still part of my routine. I get up and use anyway. If I don't use, I experience withdrawal. I'm not able to go and maintain my daily activities. I'm not able to continue going to work. If I can't get my drug, I can't work. Therefore, if I can't work, I can't get my drug. So I need to get my drug any way that I can so that I can go to work so I can be able to afford my drug. It's this terrible cycle that we get stuck in. Frequency is daily use or continuously, multiple times a day. The sources are any means necessary to obtain the substance. Causes of addiction. There is no commonly universally accepted cause of addiction. We haven't found anything specific yet. There's a lot of different reasons why people engage in addiction. But the two questions we ask are: what causes people to initiate and continue behaviors that are often very self-destructive? How can these behaviors be changed or controlled to help the involved person achieve better health and well-being? Again, part of the reason why we spend so much time looking into this is because as a treatment facility, we want to understand what caused it to be able to figure out how to uncause it. One of the first causes that we look at, and there's a bunch of different ones that we'll spend some time looking at. I'm going to definitely dive into the physical and neurobiological causes of addiction. That's one of my favorite things since I've been in this field, is finding out about that. I can't wait to share that with you. But this first one is social. Focuses on situations, social relationships, social structures. Maybe we learn from others how to use the drug. We get into this subculture. Drug use is expected and encouraged in certain social circles. Think about if somebody's looking for community and they find it in a gang, a motorcycle gang, or a group of people that are similar to them, and in that subculture, it's just something that everybody does. Socialization, social control. It's the people around us. There's so much influence from the people around us. You really do. You're known by the friends that you keep, right? And you develop this influence from them that can cause us to step into those 3 stages where you start to use because that's what everybody else is doing. Next thing you know, you're using because it's what you do now. And then before you know it, you're stuck in that late stage addiction. You start to realize it and you can't back out. You can't get out of it. All right. Medical and biological causes of addiction. We look at this as an illness. It can be genetic. We found that we can pass addiction on from one person to another. What's neat about that is we can also pass recovery on from one person to another. So it can be depressing when you start to say the addiction can be caused by, I've now changed my brain chemistry and then I pass that DNA on to my child. It can begin them offset with poor brain chemistry. They're more likely to engage in addiction. But recovery is also something that can be passed on because the brain is adapting and changing as time goes on. Brain reward mechanisms is chemicals that stimulate pleasure. Give me just a second, I'm going to get into that one. Altered brain chemistry, chemicals disrupt the natural balance, and self-medication. So a lot of the time we can take good drugs. Good drugs give us relief, help us with something. Bad drugs do the same thing. They give us relief and help us with something. Those good drugs can become bad. If we're using opiate painkillers, that's where I'd say an awful lot of people in this opiate epidemic that we're experiencing, they started off with painkillers that were prescribed to them by a doctor, developed that addiction, and then next thing you know, they're not just looking for opiate painkillers anymore, they're now looking for opiates in any form that they can get to continue the self-medication for chronic pain, for emotional issues, for trauma that they've experienced in their past. The drugs make all that, they treat it, they do, but they also come with this terrible side effect of mastering you. This is one of my favorite groups. We dig into, is it a disease or is it a choice? And this is honestly one of the greatest conflicts that society is experiencing right now. It's an underlying conflict in addictions treatment, the way that we treat addictions. If it's a choice, then we need to attack the individual and try to get them to change what decisions they're making. If it's a disease, then we need to treat it medically. We need to find a way to prescribe medications that are going to treat this as if it were cancer that a person's going to have for the rest of their life, and we need to treat it for the rest of their life. The judicial system is struggling with this. Do we lock them away in prison or do we send them to treatment? This individual has been in my courtroom multiple times. They don't seem to be getting it. It's time for them to go to prison. We're going to lock them up. In politics, we're seeing it as we're trying to engage and increase chances for people to get into treatment. And a lot of folks, it probably hits home the most with family members who are saying, why is this person doing this to me? Don't they love me? Don't they love me more than this substance that they've been using? What we find when we actually start to dig into it, yes, it has very much to do with choice. The person chose to take the drug. They choose to take the drug every time. They're deciding to. But there's also this aspect of an organ in the body, disease. Disease has to do with an organ of the body malfunctioning, not working the way that it's supposed to. So it's as if I engaged in some risky behaviors, went to a third world country without getting all my shots, and I developed communicable disease. Okay? I now have the disease because of a choice that I made. It's very similar to that, is what we look at with addiction. We call it a disease of choice. It's what we come to almost every single time that we have this discussion with a group of people, and we present the question to them. Is it a choice or is it a disease? Let's look at all the facts, let's bring them together, and we come to the conclusion that it's a disease of choice. It's a disease that we develop based on choices that we make. Universal definition of a disease is a condition of the living animal or plant body. One of its parts impairs normal functioning. Liver disease, the liver isn't functioning as it should. Heart disease, the heart stopped working the way that it was supposed to. Something with addiction is the brain has stopped functioning the way that it's supposed to, especially in late stage addiction. And so how do we do that? Start to look at the parts of the brain. There's some fascinating things that I want to share with you about the way that the brain works and how addiction can play so heavily on that. The brain is electrical and chemical. It communicates with itself through electrical and chemical means. There's an emotional part of the brain and a rational part of the brain. What we see is that in a normal, high-functioning human being, both are working at the same speed. They're both operating. The emotions are providing information saying, hey, that's scary. That's something that disgusts me, or I feel sad about that. And the rational brain is looking at that and saying, okay, well, let's figure out what that's all about. We're thinking through it. Maybe this is a little bit scary, but it's still worth it, so let's give it a shot. Or, yes, there's something sad that happened. Let's realize what that was. I've lost something that I really liked or was broken, and now I feel sad, and it's an okay feeling. Let's feel sad for a little bit. Let's move on past it. That's a normal human functioning brain. What we see in two different scenarios, in either a person who's been traumatized or a person in late stage addiction, they both have the same effect, where the rational thinking part of the brain starts to shut down. The emotional part of the brain starts to go crazy. It heats up red hot. When we look at brain scans of people in late stage addiction, the top part of the brain where the rational thinking processes happen are almost, it's like the bad part of town with store windows broken out. There's not very many trains that run through. There's wires dangling and maybe a street light that flashes every once in a while, but there's not very much going on in the rational part of the brain. But the emotional part of the brain, they're operating purely on emotion. Drive towards what do I want. The survival part of the brain is seated in that emotion part of the brain. And it's addiction hijacks survival to make using the substance to become a matter of life and death. Plays very heavy on the fear part of the brain. If I don't get that substance, I'm going to experience physical pain. That physical pain is there to keep me alive, because when I experience physical pain, that means there's something that's attacking this human unit. And if I don't get the substance, then it's going to potentially cause me to die. And so the emotional reaction is to do whatever it takes to stay alive. We don't stop and think it through. We just do whatever it takes to stay alive. Addiction hijacks the emotional response, shuts down cognitive reasoning. The brain is plastic, so we know that over the course of time, what we spend time thinking about and focusing on develops, because the brain learns this is something that's going to be important. We used this yesterday, we're using it today, we'll probably use it tomorrow. We need to strengthen this part of the brain. The things that we don't use start to fade away. That's why so many of us can't do algebra anymore. Unless we're using it every single day, we don't do, we aren't that good at complex mathematics. That's why we can't remember all of the presidents, even though in 10th grade we could recite them from Washington, Adams, Jefferson, all the way through to Obama and Trump. But over the course of time, we don't use it, we don't need it, and the brain makes space for other things. Why it's bad. Let's talk about why it's bad. Because over the course of time, the brain, if we're just focusing on that substance, then the brain begins to focus on that, gets hung up on it, and that's what part of the brain develops. The other part of the brain, the rational thinking part of the brain, starts to degrade, starts to fade away, and we start to actually lose gray matter over the course of time. The good part about this neuroplasticity, we call it neuroplasticity, the fact that we can strengthen and change the brain, is that we used to think that once it's lost, it's gone. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. There's nothing you can do once your brain is shot. But what we found is that an awful lot of that brain function can come back. With addiction, check this out. They're starting to see full brain function return to the top part of the brain within 12 to 14 months. Check it out. We have a 12-month program. If we can get somebody through a 12-month program, just get them sober for 12 months. Their top part of the functioning part of their brain comes back, starts to level out, starts to even out, and they have a much, much better chance of recovery and survival. Because in 12 to 14 months, brain function starts to return and you start to think like a normal human being again. It starts to relieve that deep-seated emotional reaction to everything. There's a quote here from Daniel Siegel. He spends a lot of time on mindfulness. And he says, this is something that was impactful for me when I first heard it. The way you focus attention changes the circuits of the brain. Are you focusing on recovery-related things or addiction-related things? When folks come into treatment, over the course of just 3 weeks, 21 days, their first couple of days here, they're still highly focused on the addiction side of things. We hear a lot of what we call war stories, people telling stories about the things that they've done when they were in their addiction. This focus, hyper-focus on addiction is natural, it's normal, it's something that we expect from somebody who was using a couple of days ago. But over the course of just a couple of weeks, we start to see that change, and folks who have been here for 3 or 4 weeks, they start to get frustrated with that. They say, that's who I used to be, that's not who I am anymore. They're starting to focus on more recovery-related things because we're spending all day, every single day, focusing on recovery. We're just talking about it in groups, we're talking about it in individual sessions. the community starts to engage in this stuff. And so that's something that we start to see, is that the way that we focus attention changes the circuits of the brain. Dopamine. One thing that every single addiction has in common is dopamine. What happens is the brain is made up of these neurons, and neurons communicate to each other by sending chemicals. One neuron will release the chemicals, the other neuron has receptors that will receive the chemicals, and that's how the brain learns what is good and what's not good. Normal dopamine is normal levels of dopamine are released when you eat a piece of chocolate cake, or you ride your dirt bike and it's go over some really sick jumps. You're feeling great. You get off your bike and you say, that was awesome. Okay, a normal amount of dopamine is released, and it's received by the other neuron and solidifies that was an enjoyable experience. That's something that I want to do again. When we chemically alter the brain, when we introduce chemicals into the brain, large amounts of dopamine are released, larger amounts than we've experienced before. What happens is there's so much dopamine that it floods all of the receptors, and over the course of time, remember, the way that you focus attention changes the circuits of the brain. So the brain is plastic, it's growing, it's developing. It says, now wait a second, I'm getting all this dopamine all the time. I need to grow some new receptors. So new receptors start to pop up. Dopamine's released in large amounts. It starts to flood those receptors, and we're growing and growing more and more receptors. And now we have a thirst for dopamine. Our brains have a thirst for dopamine. Where now, if we go and eat that piece of chocolate cake or ride my dirt bike, it's all right, but it's not as good as this other feeling that I get from introducing a substance into my body. We start to see the reason for tolerance and dependence. So now, over the course of time, I need more and more and more to be able to get the same feeling. That's because we've been growing dopamine receptors, and that same flood of dopamine doesn't do it for me anymore. We see this manifest in individuals who they lose the ability to feel pleasure in anything. That's a part of the hopelessness that we experience. We're bringing wholeness to the hopeless, right? In addiction, you experience hopelessness because you start to say, I'm never going to enjoy anything ever again. The only thing I enjoy is my substance of choice. But guess what? Over the course of time, the brain starts to come back a little bit. They call this the hedonic baseline. It's the line that you need to experience a flood of dopamine to experience pleasure. So you eat that piece of chocolate cake, it comes up over the line, it goes back down, it fades away. You ride your dirt bike, and it feels great, and then it comes back down. And then you use a substance, and it spikes up to 11, right? Over the course of time, that line goes up and up and up. And now you eat a piece of chocolate cake, it doesn't do anything for you. Or you ride your dirt bike, and it doesn't do anything for you. As people experience recovery, that line comes back down, and we start to see it. We start to see people saying, man, I went for a walk today, and for the first time in my life, in years, I actually enjoyed it. I went to the dining hall and had a meal, and I actually enjoyed the food that I was chewing. I couldn't get enough of it. I couldn't believe how enjoyable that was because I've been numb to it for so long. That's because of this release of dopamine. One last brain chemical that I want to tell you about is glutamate. This is my favorite brain chemical lately. We see this, again, trauma and addiction. Experience this in the exact same way. Glutamate is related to learning. It's when something terrible, absolutely terrible happens. My brain releases glutamate and says, this was so bad, I never want it to happen again. We need to learn everything that's around right now. And if we can do that, then we can avoid this in the future. Same thing happens with addiction. When something so good, best thing you've ever felt in your entire life, happens, you memorize everything around. And then the brain says, I want to remember where this is. I want to remember the color of the walls, the smells, the sights, the sounds, everything. So that if I hear anything that sounds like or looks like or feels like the environment that I was in when this happened, then I can start looking around and start looking for that substance. That's where we get triggers from. The brain releases glutamate, causes the memory of everything to be seared into the brain, so that now when I smell the smell of the cologne, smells like the guy who sells me drugs, I start to look around to see if I can find that substance that makes me feel so good. The brain is so smart; it's working all the time to be able to get back to that feeling of what the drugs provide. We see it in trauma. The lady who has a car accident on a bridge, now every time that she comes close to that bridge, she can't drive across it. Her body physically will not allow her to drive across that bridge because it remembers on that bridge is where I had the accident. So the fix for this, the cure, the way that we address this is through mindfulness, through recognizing what it is, recognizing that this is not something that's actually happening right now. When this happens, this is something that's been seared into my mind, and now it doesn't mean that I have to go find that substance, or it doesn't mean that I have to avoid whatever it might be. Addiction and PTSD mirror each other in a lot of ways, but this is one of the ways that's been most fascinating to me, is that the way that it creates triggers. If we look at all those things, if we look at the way that the brain adjusts, develops, and changes, again, I'm not trying to excuse any addiction. All I'm trying to do is draw attention to the fact that this is an internal brain change. What it can mean for you is encourage your loved one to maintain those recovery-oriented activities. It's so important to maintain that, because once a person is developed an addiction, it's not something that really ever goes away. It is a chronic, relapsing disease. We can experience years and years and years of remission, but the brain has still been changed, and it still requires maintenance to keep it sober. I talk about the law of entropy, the fact that nature tends toward decay. If we stop working on it, if we stop working to maintain sobriety, then we start to slip back towards addiction, and that's a scary thing to see. Encourage your loved one to maintain recovery-oriented activities to keep their brain healthy and sober. I also want to talk about some of the spiritual aspects of addiction, causes of addiction. Addiction, like all diseases, is the result of sin. Original man screwed up, said, I would rather prioritize myself than what I should do, what God's overall plan for me is in my life. And once that happened, it led to the downfall of humanity where we are now, and it led to everything that's bad that we experience. It led to addiction, it led to weeds growing, it led to people doing terrible things to other people. All of that is a result of sin. And so there is a spiritual aspect of recovery that's necessary. When we look at AA, that's been so tremendously successful over the years, the first few steps of AA are the recognition of there's something out there that's bigger than me. I need to recognize a God of my understanding. I need to turn my life over to Him and recognize that He can help me with this. So separation from God, if we aren't addressing that through appropriate means of developing a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, then we're going to try to find another way to satisfy that emptiness, that brokenness in our life. And a lot of the time we can find that through substance use. It does a great job of filling that hole. It makes us feel better. It makes us feel content and happy and peaceful for a very brief period of time, and then we need to use again. We see the effects of sin and generational curses. There is something to that. There's something to the effects of what I do has an impact on my children. Those can be broken too. We can work towards breaking those generational curses, because there's a tremendous power of redemption. God can do anything, okay? And if we spend time thinking about that God can do anything, then we realize that He can. There's nothing that I can do to screw up His plan for my life or for somebody else's life. He's going to pull us back into it. A lack of a biblical value system, pride and entitlement are some things that lead to addiction. Pride is one of the things that keeps people in addiction. I don't want to feel bad about myself. I don't want to talk to somebody about this. I'd rather just keep feeling the way that I do. We see that addiction itself is not sinful. The things that we do, the continued use, the turning ourselves over to it, those are things that are sinful. But the addiction itself, if we look at it from that disease model, is not in itself sinful. It's something that's broken inside of us that we need treatment and help for. Addiction really wraps up the whole human being: the physical, emotional, spiritual, social, mental, environmental, career. Everything is impacted by addiction, and so we need to be able to provide help for folks. So how is it addressed? A person can voluntarily recognize their life is to the point where they can't control it anymore, and then they can step into recovery. They can say, I've experienced enough pain, I've experienced enough hardship in my life, I'm ready to do something about it. This is where they're self-motivated. They want to help themselves. They can experience treatment involuntarily. Probation officer says, if you don't go to treatment, I'm going to send you to jail. That's a powerful motivator. I've heard so many stories about people saying, I just wanted to be able to walk outside. I just wanted to be able to breathe fresh air. And so I'm willing to do whatever treatment is required as long as I don't go to jail. What we found, there's studies that have shown that treatment is more effective for people who are involuntarily motivated to go to treatment than people that voluntarily sign up for it themselves. And I think that comes from this idea that if I recognize my need and I go sign myself into treatment, at least I'm a little bit ahead of the curve. I'm not really that bad yet. By the time a probation officer tells you need to do this or I'm going to lock you up for a long period of time, that's when I realized, boy, this is getting really serious. I think that has something to do with it. Also, there's additional motivation from knowing that all my work here in treatment is going to be communicated to my probation officer or a judge in drug court, and that it's going to look better for me if I engage and dig into treatment. And then intervention, families. Again, we have an influence. We have an ability to influence other people, to create a situation where it's less painful to go to treatment than it is to not go to treatment. And we spend a lot of time talking about pain-based motivation. It's something that we look at, that if we allow people to experience the pain of their addiction, then they'll be more motivated to go to treatment. Nobody will make a change in their life until the pain of staying the same is worse than the pain of change, because change it's hard. It's not easy. It's not anything that any of us want to do. So we need to be able to experience that pain in order to motivate change. Without treatment, we see what you folks have seen. It's progressive, it's ongoing, it gets worse. Compulsive behaviors continue to progress. Everything is progressive. Addiction gets worse and worse and worse. It doesn't just stay the same. Very few people can maintain steady use of a substance without experiencing that level of tolerance and dependence. Person addiction can't change on their own. Requires assistance with biology, behavior, and social dynamics, counseling, maybe even medication-assisted treatment for some folks. Once addicted, the individual has moved into a different state of being. You see some of the costs to society there. I'm going to give you a moment just to read down through those, but it's tremendous. It's an impact on the family. It's an impact on the criminal justice system, on our country. Tremendous impact on our country. And it's an impact on lives lost. That's one of the biggest things that we're seeing, is the impact on lives lost. There's that one number that I told you about earlier, that only 10.5% of people in addiction. If I said that we had 24 million people with diabetes and only 2.4 million people were getting insulin, that would be ridiculous. But that's what we're seeing for addiction in this country right now. 300 million Americans, 30 million living in some level of active addiction, and only a tenth of them are actually making it into treatment. So thank you, folks, for the work that you're doing as families. Thank you for digging in, supporting your loved one, continue to be a part of their life, which can be hard sometimes, I imagine. But folks, you're doing something that's so important. I hope that you'll continue to engage, continue to participate in family sessions and visits, continue to support your loved one. It's so tremendously important for their recovery and for saving their life. Thank you for listening to this today.